Howdy. Our group is going to do a presentation on Indonesia, and we're going to analyze some of the factors that have impacted economic growth and development over the course of this country's history, including recent factors such as the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Max Sanchez, and I will be presenting the first part of our slideshow. So, location. Indonesia is located in Southeast Asia and the Oceanic region north of Australia. The capital city of Indonesia is Jakarta. Some neighboring nations and city-states are Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, Brunei, East Timor, the Philippines, and Australia. Singapore, in addition to the aforementioned nations and city-states, it also is going to share maritime borders and interact through import and export with some larger nations in that region of Asia. These are going to include India, Sri Lanka. There are some Pacific islands to the east as well that it interacts with. Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Taiwan, and China. And although these are the primary nations that Indonesia is going to interact with, at least in that region of Asia, today sea travel and maritime travel is so advanced that really, because of its location, Indonesia essentially, from an economic perspective, shares these maritime borders with pretty much every country in the world. And we'll see later on that they do have a pretty extensive trade net. So some popular facts and culture about Indonesia. Indonesia is composed of 17,508 islands in total. However, only about 6,000 of these islands are actually inhabited by people. It's pretty culturally diverse with over 300 languages spoken in Indonesia. However, the official language is going to be Bahasa Indonesian. As far as the religious demographics go, Islam composes more than 80% of Indonesian residents. Christianity, Hinduism, and Buddhism are also practiced in Indonesia. Indonesia actually has the highest Islamic population on earth. Some local ethnic groups in Indonesia are Javanese, Sudanese, Malay, and Madura. So population size and area. So the population of Indonesia is going to be about 278 million people, which is actually going to put it at the fourth most populous country in the entire world, right behind China, India, and the United States. So now you can see how, since they have that 80% Islamic following, that's why they're going to have the largest Islamic population in the world. So the way that the population is distributed in the major urban areas, Jakarta, which is the capital, is going to have about 8.5 million people. Surabaya is going to be behind Jakarta pretty significantly with about 2.37 million people. Medan is going to be behind that with about 1,750,000 people. And then Bandung is going to be behind Medan with about 1.7 million people. And because Indonesia is so spread out, it's actually going to have a diameter that's actually larger than the continental United States. However, the overall surface area is going to be about 5 times smaller than the US. And this is going to stand at almost 2 million square miles. So climate and natural resources. Indonesia has a very tropical climate. About 81% of the land is actually going to be at an average of about 82 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's due to its position in the equatorial region of the world. There's going to be pretty high humidity in Indonesia and varying rainfall due to these monsoons. And this is going to contribute to a very warm and volatile climate in that region. Especially when it comes to typhoons, which are pretty common later in the year in Indonesia from September to December. As far as natural resource endowments, Indonesia's primary exports are going to be petroleum, tin, and nickel, or at least primary natural resource exports. And as we discussed in class, significant natural resource endowments can be a contributing factor to inequality, which we will discuss later on about Indonesia's relatively high Gini index. But for now, that concludes my section of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Max. So I'm Thomas Santala, and I'll start by discussing other geographic factors. So Indonesia is the largest archipelago in the world, but it's also in the heart of the Ring of Fire. There are many geographical features, including rainforests, volcanoes, grasslands, beaches, tsunamis, earthquakes, and mountain ranges. There are many factors as to why this is the case, and the main reason is the location of Indonesia. It's on 3 tectonic plates, which are the Eurasian plate, the Pacific plate, and the Indo-Australian plate. So some of the pros of its location are the land is very diverse and has easy access to international trade. And the cons are that natural disasters are quite common. So to start with some economic facts about Indonesia, Indonesia's 2020 GDP per capita was $3,870. So its income group classification according to the World Bank, it is currently a lower middle income country. And back in 2019, it was actually qualified as an upper middle income country. But due to COVID-19's economic impact, its GDP per capita dropped, and that brought it below the threshold of 4,046. So for its regional status and relations, it is a chair of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which will be abbreviated to ASEAN. And it's basically a regional bloc that promotes free trade between the participating countries of Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. And it's a really beneficial for the region because these are sometimes smaller countries with not great economies, and this allows free trade, which makes it just easier for them to grow as a region. And the top 5 export partners are China, Singapore, Japan, Thailand, and the United States. And the top 5 import partners are China, United States, Japan, Singapore, and India. So for its historical GDP growth, post-colonization, Indonesia's GDP per capita was actually quite low. It was around $50 in 1967, but it began to rise steadily until 1995 when it reached over $1,000. However, the Asian financial crisis in 1997 caused the GDP per capita to plummet to just over $450 in 1998. However, through good economic policies, Indonesia recovered well, and their GDP per capita rose quite fast to over $3,700 in 2012. But then a dip in commodity prices caused the GDP per capita to fall, and it eventually recovered, but then fell again due to the impacts of COVID-19 in 2020. And for colonization, so before colonization, Indonesia was not considered a single place, but an area full of many groups of people who interacted through high amounts of boat travel. This travel and maritime connection created economic opportunities through trade, but also created many wars and conflicts due to the lack of unity between these islands. During the late 1500s, the Southeast Asian nations were subjected to European colonization. Indonesia was first found by the Portuguese, where they collected spices such as nutmeg and Cuban pepper. And in 1602, the Dutch East India Company took over and officially colonized Indonesia. And the Dutch had control until the early 1940s when Japan took over until 1945. And now Travis will continue the presentation.
Thank you, Thomas. So my name is Travis McAleer, and first I'm going to start off with the economic and political timeline for Indonesia. So this is a very high level look at what's happened since 1945, whenever Indonesia declared independence from the Dutch colonization, as well as the Japanese who had come and taken over their land for the past 5 years. In 49, they were acknowledged as independent from the Dutch Netherlands after years of conflict in both political and actual battle and turmoil. In 1966, General Suharto installed the New Order. This was an authoritarian regime that introduced a lot of political stability, fixed a lot of problems of where power was being given to different parts of the government, and they started increasing investments with Western nations. In 1967, a year later, they co-founded the ASEAN group that Thomas was talking about, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which further stimulated economic growth for those countries as they started trading more and sharing their imports and export strategies. In 1983, Indonesia had decontrolled their interest rate and removed a credit ceiling, which lowered excess reserves. This also became a problem, as you'll see later on in the timeline. In 1997, there was a collapse of the Thai baht triggers, which triggered an economic crisis going throughout Asia due to the fact that everybody was tied in through the Southeast Asian Nation Pact. And due to the decontrolled interest rate and the credit ceiling going away, there was an uncontrolled rise in credit and borrowing, which therefore Indonesia had a collapse on their currency, and this caused a major problem. So in 1998, to conflict this, Indonesia formed the Indonesia Bank Restructuring Agency, which tried to revive the banking industry after that economic collapse. In 1999, there was a city-state that granted independence from Indonesia. And then in 2004, the famous Boxing Day tsunami killed over 125,000 Indonesians and caused over $500 billion in infrastructural damage to the country, which absolutely created a recession for the country due to the fact that they lost so much infrastructure and so many lives were lost. In 2008, the global recession coming from the US stock market crash hit them. However, they still maintained a 5% growth rate due to the large amount of domestic consumption that they were backing off of. And then in 2011, Indonesia took control and became the chair of the ASEAN group. So the Human Development Index, as you can see, since 1990, Indonesia has had a steady growth rate in every single aspect of the Human Development Index. So their life expectancy has been going up. The mean years of schooling, the expected years of schooling has been going up. Their GNI per capita has been going up at a pretty steady rate. And accordingly, their HDI value has been going up. For 2019, their HDI was 0.718. This is 107 out of 189 countries that are recognized for the HDI value, which is very good. That's at the higher end of the spectrum. Next, we're going to talk about macroeconomic stability. So as we said, before 1940, Indonesia was a colony of the Dutch Empire. And so whenever they did gain official independence back in 1949, there were a number of immediate risks and issues as far as lack of quality or dependable infrastructure. So all the infrastructure that the colony had been provided by the Dutch Empire was pulled out. So therefore they were left with a lot of both political and physical infrastructure that they were missing and had to make up for. There were continuous demonstrations and protests due to the fact that there was this shift in power. Power was still being given. And so people were taking too much power. There was a little bit of an authoritarian going on. So demonstrations and protests were reaching out and speaking out against that abuse of power. There was a lot of bribery and corruption going on because people were doing a power grab, trying to gain this power in this new formed government. And then frequent natural disasters like the Boxing Day tsunami that I spoke of, earthquakes, floods, volcanic eruptions due to the fact that they're on the ring of fire. All those continuously were affecting Indonesia and the growth of their economy. But since the financial crisis in the 1990s, Indonesia has had continuous growth and economic development. They're now the 10th largest economy in regards to purchasing power parity in the world. Further on, they've also reduced their poverty with rates falling to under 10% in 2020, which is an extreme growth from where they were in the 70s and 80s. This has been guided by a new strategy they've put forth in a 20-year development plan. It's called the Rencana Pambanguan Jangku Menga Nasional 5-year medium-term development plans. So these 4 plans go into this 20-year development plan. Each has its own set of development priorities and what it's focusing on. And all of this aspires to improve Indonesia's human capital and their global competitiveness to move from number 10 to hopefully into the top 5 of economies regarding purchasing power parity. Talk about political stability. They right now are governed by a presidential representative democracy as a republic where the president of Indonesia serves as both the head of state and head of government, as well as they have a multi-party system inset. So the government is in charge of executive power. Both the government and the bicameral People's Consultative Assembly, which is their Congress, has legislative power, and then the judicial branch is separate from those 2 branches and has its own set of power as well. They do not have a strong checks and balance system set up, which causes lots of turmoil, lots of conflict in between both the parties, the different branches, as well as sometimes problems with bribery and corruption of people trying to get stuff passed through. And according to the Index of Political Stability, they are right now at a score of negative 1.03, where the world average was at a negative 0.7. Basically, what this index says is that if it's negative, they have a likelihood of having problems with transfer of power and having problems with corruption. And according to this, the fact that Indonesia has a negative 1.03 score means that they do have a much higher likelihood of a disorderly transfer of government power. Finally, to talk about investments in infrastructure. So combating the loss of infrastructure that they had whenever they became an independent country, the Committee of Infrastructure Priorities Development Acceleration, or KPPIP, has been responsible for developing a number of projects and figuring out what they want to focus on. And they've been utilizing the PPP, or the private-public partnership, in order to get private companies to come in there and engage in the development of this infrastructure. This has 2 benefits. One, with private groups, they are able to utilize the economic resources that they have and fast track some of these projects, as well as it takes away from the possibility of government corruption and government stalling taking a precedent over these projects and therefore slowing them down or misutilizing them. So this KPPIP is dealing with all sorts of entities in the infrastructure domain. They're dealing with both cyber, physical infrastructure, helping build out the country's resources, their natural resources, their gas pipelines, water, sewage, all that good stuff that is required for a first world country. Indonesia is working on focusing that, which in turn, all of this is going to further stall the development of infrastructure within the community, because they are still trying to figure out what they're going to focus on. There is still a problem with corruption and with all of these numerous private groups wanting to be first in line, so their resources are not being shared properly and not efficiently. So that concludes my portion of the presentation. Next, I'm going to hand it off to Gavin.
Thank you, Travis. So in regards to investments in education, there's not been an overwhelming amount of growth in education. However, because the government's primary focus has been on increasing enrollment and graduation rates in primary and secondary schools, there's not been university education has gotten less attention and money. There are no Indonesian universities among the top 400 according to the Times Higher Education World University Rankings as of 2013 and 14. Although the University of Indonesia did place 309th in the US World University Rankings. It is the highest ranked Indonesian institution. A lack of financing, bad administration, and a lack of internationalization have all been cited for Indonesia's academic underachievement. All right, and quality of governance and institutions. Expropriation risk includes all discriminatory measures done by a host government that do deprive the investor of their investment without proper recompensation. Events such as changing of a legal regime, denial of justice, or embargo are all included in the analysis of expropriation risk. According to the globaleconomy.com, which is cited in our bibliography at the end of this presentation, countries are classified into 7 categories, from 1 being low risk to 7 being high risk. Indonesia, by this measure, records an expropriation risk of 4 as of 2019, which is above the world average, which is 3. This meaning that the quality of governance and institutions as of recently has not been up to par with the rest of the world. And trade figures, you see that it's pretty balanced. The 2019 exports and imports, you see 168 and 171 billion respectively. So they are a net importer by a slight margin. Top 5 trade partners include China, the US, Japan, Singapore, and India. And as for international trade and globalization, since 1960, you see it's increased, which has you see a technological spillover reduced, or as a result of that. And environment for private enterprise, foreign investment as share of GDP has increased dramatically since the 80s due to trade liberalization, large business conglomerates, state-owned companies, foreign investors that make up the formal private sector for Indonesia. According to estimates, the informal sector employs about 54% of the private sector businesses, primarily micro and small businesses, though. The presence of a significant informal sector does slow productivity growth, and it decreases a country's global competitiveness over time. Moreover, a slew of new state-owned firms run by local governments have sprouted up. While progress is being made, the measures targeted at enhancing and enabling the environment for the private sector are taking longer than expected to implement. And a quick poverty overview. Obviously, like we discussed in class, rural Indonesia does have a higher poverty rate. You see 22.4% as compared to urban Indonesia, which is 14.6%. Like I said, this reflects not only the nation's wealth inequality, but the concentration of wealth in urban areas in general. Income inequality has increased by about 40% from 2000 to 2013, which is about a decade. And according to purchasing power parity GDP, you see that they have a 3.3 trillion number, just 7th largest in the world, and they still are 15th largest in the world according to the exchange rate. This difference reflects the tremendous amount of labor being contributed to the GDP by rural Indonesians that might not be counted. Many of them are living in poverty. You see some numbers as far as poverty gap indexes, and you see the headcount index is 9.8% living below the national poverty line of 2020 and 2.3% living below the international poverty line of $1.90 a day, according to 2011 PPP measurement. That is according to the Asian Development Bank, which is also stored in our bibliography. And as for the poverty gap index, you see 20% as of 2020, but using the 2011 PPP number of $1.90 a day, according to the World Bank, and a Gini coefficient of 0.37. That was, prefaced by Max earlier in the presentation. All right, and I believe this is where I will hand it off to Thomas to conclude our presentation.
Thank you, Gavin. I'm Thomas Varble, and we're going to look at the poverty improvement programs. The poorest families in Indonesia benefit from conditional cash transfer programs. The Family Hope Program, or the program Keluarga Harapan, is a social protection program implemented in 2007 in Indonesia. It assists Indonesian families who are extremely destitute. This program has lately been expanded to include Indonesia's 10 million poorest families. When faced with disease or health issues, low-income families are frequently put in financial jeopardy. When low-income families become ill, Indonesia's healthcare guarantee program, known as Jemkesmas, protects them from this risk. As of 2012, around 76.4 million Indonesians in the low-income category were covered by this program. While poverty rates only seem to be decreasing at a marginal pace, it is in part due to programs like these being implemented within the last 2 to 3 decades. Fertility, contraception, and termination policies. Contraception and family planning has been a large focus for Indonesia for the last decade. When it comes to contraception, it is overwhelmingly injectable. Fertility rate is around 2.29 births per woman, which is slightly above the natural rate. Increase in population. There is a paid leave for 12 days in Indonesia. Advertising campaigns for the family planning have become popular methods of limiting population growth and its strain on economic resources. An example of this, if you look at the bottom, is 2 is enough, very famous slogan for them. For demographic transitions, they're in the third stage of demographic transition. It's the late expanding stage. This is where you have declining birth rates. And if you look at the picture in the bottom right, that is what the actual chart looks like. It's leaving the pyramid and kind of becoming a tree in a sense. It is widely available and cheap for contraceptions. And about 2 children per family are optimizing domestic satisfaction. Declining mortality rates are happening due to the improvement of healthcare. For future projections on growth and development, the government revenue of Indonesia is significantly lower than that of most of other emerging countries, including those in the region. Indonesia urgently needs to expand government development investment in order to realize its significant economic potential and attain the Sustainable Development Goals. Higher income would allow for more spending on education, infrastructure, health, and social safety nets, resulting in more inclusive and sustainable growth. Additional fiscal resources would also assist Indonesia in addressing climate change concerns and transitioning to a greener economy. Factors that hampered the growth and development. Factor number 1 is the lack of access to affordable healthcare. Factor number 2 is the weak physical infrastructure. Factor number 3 is a weaker political stability. However, it is higher than world average. Number 4 is concentration of wealth in urban areas. Factor 5 is the natural disasters. The JKN. In 2014, the government of Indonesia established National Health Insurance Program, Jaminan Kesehatan Nasional, which is administered by the Social Security Organization Agency in order to improve the management of its health system and provide easy access to health services to the entire population, with a focus on targeting and subsidizing the care for the poor. Increasing women's access to high quality maternity and newborn health services is one of the program's goals, with the ultimate goal of lowering Indonesia's high MMR. Ongoing healthcare crisis. Despite JKN and other significant improvements in the past 50 years, Indonesian healthcare still lags behind the rest of the world and the needs of the impoverished residents. Hunger and malnutrition still affect over 20 million Indonesians. Diseases common among impoverished populations, such as malaria and dengue, still run rampant. Greater investment in the public health program and infrastructure for clean water and sanitation facilities is still needed to help improve the health situation of Indonesia's impoverished people. And the rest of the slides are the bibliography, and this concludes our presentation.